We are live. This is episode number 93 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today on our panel, we have Justin Ribeiro,
Hello, wonderful people.
Leon Revel,
Hello, everyone.
and I'm your host, Eric Isaacson. And before we get started with our guest, who is an awesome person for CSS and web and CMS and all sorts of awesome things, we're going to I'll let Justin just kind of take the wheels here for a second.
So from all of us here at the Web Platform Podcast, we want to send our hearts and thoughts out with those of you who are in Orlando, to the victims and the families, their friends, and those working tirelessly to help during this time of significant sadness. The events were a great injustice. There is much anger, and there is much healing to do. And, you know, as web developers, we travel sort of the world, and I've had the opportunity to spend some time in Orlando, and it's such a vibrant and wonderful community. And our hearts truly go out to those who have suffered such great loss. So we hope that if there's anything that you can do in Orlando or whatnot around the world to try to make this better, please do so, as we try to, as well as we all try to move forward and heal and act to have a better world. So tough start to the week for sure, and it touches everyone everywhere.
Thank you, Justin. So today we are going to be talking about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. We're going to be on episode 93 talking about CSS layout, composition, and modules. So we have an expert in that area, which is Rachel Andrew.
Hello, nice to be here.
Thank you for coming on. Been trying to organize something around CSS layouts for a while, and finally we're able to get it. And it's a pleasure having you on. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been up to?
Yeah, I'm Rachel Andrew. I am from the UK and I live in Bristol here. And yeah, my day job really is as I'm co-founder of the CMS Perch. So that's what I sort of do as a job. But my sort of weird hobby is in looking at CSS and CSS for layout in particular. And I've spent about the last 3 years playing around with the grid spec, the CSS grid spec, which is sort of hidden behind a flag in browsers, and sort of writing about that and trying to get people excited about it too.
Now, the CSS has layout? I didn't know it did layout. I thought it just scattered things around sort of the world that we know it to be. Tell us more about this CSS layout, because as someone who really is horrible at CSS at times, I feel like I fight it all the time. How is the world of layout options today?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, CSS layout has been really, really hard, essentially because everything that we currently use for layout, so floating things and display table and inline block and all this stuff, is essentially a hack. You know, none of this was designed as a layout system. It's sort of really comes from the roots of CSS being for sort of laying out documents, your academic documents, so maybe like just sort of floating an image to the top and left of that or whatever. So we don't really have a layout system. And over the last few years, we've started to see things like Flexbox, which I think people are probably more familiar with. That's kind of out there and people are using it. And now CSS Grid Layout kind of coming together as a sort of new layout system, along with some other sort of interesting modules that do various tasks. So really for the first time, we've actually got a system for layout that has been made for the web in CSS, a sort of native layout system that kind of solves a lot of the problems that we see and that we struggle with as developers.
So you said it's behind a flag in some browsers. Kind of, you know, how soon is this going to be kind of mainstream? When can we really start to use it for kind of all of our projects?
Right, so obviously Flexbox has got pretty good browser support at this point, but Flexbox has really been designed for, well, it's designed for one-dimensional layout, so laying things out in a row or a column, not both at the same time. And that's pretty much, you can use that unless you've got to support very old versions of IE and things, but even so, you could still use it as an enhancement. The other kind of part of the picture, and for doing two-dimensional layout, so laying things out in rows and columns at the same time, that's grid, and that's what's behind browser flags.
Okay.
So really, what sort of really has been waiting for is the spec to be finished, and for then the browser implementers to say, yep, this all looks cool, and ship that in browsers.
Are there any polyfills or anything like that that you can kind of ship with it?
You don't really want a polyfill layout. People always ask this. I think that the reality the reality will be, and we already see this with Flexbox, is that both of these modules can be used really as an enhancement. So you can build a simple layout and then you can enhance it using all the cool like alignment capabilities of something like Flexbox or Grid.
Mm-hmm.
Work really nicely as an enhancement. So you can kind of get stuff working simply and then build on that. And I think that's really the way forward, rather than trying to polyfill this stuff with, with JavaScript, because that's never going to be a good experience.
Even the polyfills for Flexbox for IE9, like and IE10 even is a little buggy. It's really, it just doesn't work so well, that I've seen at least.
No, I mean I would always go for progressively enhancing stuff. Using this new stuff as enhancement initially, or using it for small components in your layout initially that otherwise can display in a linear fashion or what have you, and then as we go forward, building on that.
So what's a good example of that, like that's out in the wild? Because I've seen a lot of people just say, well, if I can't use Flexbox because I have to support IE9, or I can't use Grid because I have to support IE10 or whatever. I think IE10 actually has a -ms, but if I have to support some older browser, right? I don't think I've seen too many really good implementations that are production worthy.
Yeah, as the person stuff to look up, there's a lady called Zoe Gillenwater who works with Booking.com, and there's various sets of her slides and videos as well of her presentations, where she does some really good examples of how they at Booking.com enhance their layouts with Flexbox. So they have to support right back to old browsers. I think maybe even IE8, and yet so she demonstrates in her talks, how you can take a component and lay it out simply for older browsers, maybe using inline block or something, and then use Flexbox to enhance that for everybody else, which works pretty nicely. And I think that's really the way to go with this stuff. Is not to say, oh, well, I can only use it for everything.
Right. Is that the same person at Zomagy.com?
Yes, that's the same person.
Okay.
Yeah, so she's writing some really good stuff, and she's got that real experience of being, in a situation where it has to work well in old browsers. Something like Booking.com, they're going to have a significant number of people in old IEs and things coming to the site.
Which is a shame.
It is a shame.
I'm going to say it because I feel like
Somebody's
every time I hear IE8, I die a little inside, knowing that I have to work on IE later today. So regardless, how does one progressively enhance CSS? Like, I've seen a lot of techniques. I know I use some myself. But is there a sort of base level that, when we talk about sort of this progressive enhancement, and I love progressive enhancement, I'm a big fan of the concept that if you don't necessarily have the features for it, you still get an experience that you can use, that, sort of the beauty of the web. But is there sort of a base like, hey, this is how you should progressively enhance CSS such that new users get a base feature or a slightly enhanced feature set?
I think it really depends on what you're targeting. I mean, if you've got very few users in some older browsers, then you might be quite happy to give them a very, very simple layout, essentially serving them what you're serving mobile users perhaps, just a nice linearized, yes, this is all readable layout. If you've got a lot of users in those, with those browsers, then you're probably going to want to do a bit more. And maybe use things like, using floated layouts or inline block or what have you, and then enhancing that, which you can do. Because what you tend to lose with our older style layouts is you lose all that nice alignment stuff. So getting things to line up neatly is always really hard. But that's the sort of stuff that you can add, because the people for whom it isn't as beautifully lined up, well, they don't know any different. They're in IE8. The entire web looks terrible to them. So actually, giving them something simpler that isn't going to blow up everywhere is better than trying to hack around it and giving them a really janky experience because you've laid on all this JavaScript to try and get the same layout that you've got. Yeah.
I suppose what a lot of people really care about is getting at the content that they've gone to the site in the first place. So providing they can access that and read it and see it, kind of, that's kind of the main important thing, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the problem with using JavaScript polyfills, is that you can actually make the experience of people who are already in a bad browser, they're in an old browser, a slow browser, and then you're adding all this stuff, which then makes the experience even worse.
That's 5 minutes to scroll down the page.
Yeah, I mean that's terrible. Actually you're better off giving them something which is the right sort of stuff for the browser they've got.
Like, hey guy, here's a link. Just go here and in another browser. And
I scroll jack everybody. That's the key. No, you just scroll jack everything. That's the way to really give them a really solid jank-like experience, right? Because the more jank they have, right, they switch at that point. Is that the way it works? Probably not. Yeah.
It was.
So you mentioned. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, Leon. Go all right.
I was just going to ask about, so you mentioned like grid and Flexbox. Kind of, is there some hard and fast rules about when you use one over the other, or any other rules along those lines?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, it's really the one-dimensional versus two-dimensional thing. I mean, if we were in a few years into the future and we had both, and you're saying, well, should I use grid or Flexbox for this element? Typically, if you just want to control rows or columns, then Flexbox is really great. Where it starts to be a problem is if you want to do both. So you want, for instance, to lay things out in a row and then the next row all to line up with the row above. Well, Flexbox doesn't really do that, because as if you allow flex items to wrap, each row, if you're working in rows, becomes its own flex container essentially. So content distribution happens across that row. And then you go to the next row and it's not taking any notice of the row above. Whereas with grid, you're saying, well, this is my grid, and then my elements fit onto that grid. So you're kind of defining a sort of more of a top-down approach, saying, here's a grid, elements go onto the grid. Whereas with Flexbox, it's kind of almost like you're working from the content out sometimes. You're saying, I've got this bunch of navigation items. I don't care how wide they are. I just want the space between them to be the same. And that's a real Flexbox use, because you're letting the content kind of define how it spaces out.
There is a bit of a misconception about that too, right? I mean, the idea that Flexbox was designed to do grid sort of operations is really not the case. I mean, I hear people say, "Oh, it was designed for grid." And it's not really what that was for. Like, there is a spec for grid.
Yes, it's kind of a shame the two couldn't have come along together. I think what we've got there is a system for layout that includes the two things that do different tasks really. And I think using them together, once we've actually got grid out there in production and more people are starting to use it and use it for real things, we'll see more of, where those decisions are, the different things the two are good at.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed when dealing with CSS is a lot of developers will do one of two things. It's like if they don't like CSS, I should say. So there's a lot of front-end developers who even don't really gravitate towards CSS. They just want to do JavaScript, maybe some HTML, or JSX or something, right? But they'll go one of two camps. You'll have this do everything in JavaScript camp, and you'll have the other camp of, well, I don't know CSS, so I'm going to bootstrap everything. So let's use Flexbox. Let's force that into a grid. Let's force that into Bootstrap. And let's just recreate the wheel and make a grid system based on this, or they'll just use out of the box Bootstrap, and then they'll have, the styles, because Bootstrap was built, right, as a boilerplate even. It wasn't built to be used the way it is on the web. Like you can look at a site and be like, yeah, that's Bootstrap, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, have you encountered this, or have you? I mean, obviously you have, but have you seen like other? Maybe I'm missing some other camp that does these things. Like, what's been your experience with this? I guess.
Well, I mean, the whole thing. I mean, obviously, I run a business, and we've used some of these frameworks and so on. to get sites up quickly. And I think everyone's doing that. And the reason we're doing that is that actually layout is pretty hard these days. And so, I totally understand why we have the frameworks and why people want to use them. The problem we're seeing with things like Flexbox coming through is that we're starting to see people trying to recreate Bootstrap and so on in Flexbox and really losing the power of it. Because the whole thing with Flexbox, and particularly with Grid, is that you can completely define all of your layout in the CSS, which allows you to redefine it at different breakpoints, get an awful lot of sort of responsiveness for free, essentially. So you kind of lose that if you don't use the sort of the grid as it's been designed, or use Flexbox as it's been designed. So that's kind of a shame.
Well, and there is a lot of case for. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Eric.
No, I was just gonna say that's yeah. Why don't you just go there, Justin? I was gonna say nothing.
Are you sure? A lot of times
I totally
when you look at
go ahead.
No, when you look at sort of framework stuff, frameworks are sort of a means to an end. There is a reason that people use frameworks. It could be because they don't want to have to deal with that particular layer. It could be that they want some feature set that comes from it. I mean, there is a case for rapid development frameworks. I mean, they do have that sort of approach. But to Rachel's point, there is a misconception there. Like, there is a huge gap between, oh, hey, I'm going to recreate this. You don't have to, I see it a lot every time something new sort of comes out, where there's a lot of reinvention of the wheel as opposed to actually doing work that needs to get done, where, oh, hey, look, I've redone this. Well, why'd you redo it? What was broke? Nothing really. I just felt like, it just did not meet my criteria for, variable naming. Which, internally, you look at sort of stuff like that and you go, no, man, please don't. Like, let's not go down this road, dudes. Let's move forth into things. And with CSS, I don't think it happens as much, and I don't like the campness of things, like the thing you were talking about, Eric. I'm only this camp. I'm only that camp. I get it. Specialization is good, but it can also be really boring.
Yeah, I mean, I find with the Flexbox frameworks, at one point it seemed like there was a new Flexbox grid framework appearing about twice a week, because I have all these Google alerts set up.
Yeah.
Because I have a newsletter I send out once a week of sort of layout stuff that occurs. So I have all these Google alerts, and like twice a week I'm getting, here, look at my new Flexbox grid framework, and I was like, yeah. and they're all pretty much the same, and they're all trying to use Flexbox like a grid, and and it's the same.
That's an interesting
kind of
side effect in Flexbox, though. I've seen, like, my semantic markup is much better. Like, I'm not using as much divs, or I'm using some sections too, but I'm not using as much of like div to get that you would have in something like Bootstrap or a grid.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and then when you look at CSS grid layout, you can really do without a lot of that stuff, because you're defining the grid itself in your CSS. So you don't need to sort of fragment your markup and stick in rows and things, which makes it an awful lot more flexible as much as anything else. Whether you care or not about putting classes in your markup, it's just much more flexible if it's there in the CSS.
So Flexbox, is that kind of, I mean, I know I've seen quite a few articles around, maybe a year ago or something, where, people were saying don't use Flexbox for everything, and then people are saying use Flexbox for everything now, and it can be done, you can use it for the entire site layout and stuff like that. Is that something you'd recommend? Obviously, if you can't get hold of Grid just yet, can you use Flexbox to kind of do the whole layout for your site, providing it kind of meets your criteria?
I think if you're not hitting the issues with the fact that it isn't two-dimensional, if you don't, because of your particular layout, you're not hitting those issues, then fine. Personally, if I've got a complex layout, I would still be using, I quite like the SUSY, SUSY grid system, which works with SAS.
Yeah.
That basically builds a float-based system, but it abstracts away a load of the maths, so you're not having to get your calculator out and work out weird percentages in order to get your layout to work. So Susie's really great. So I tend to use that for if I want to create a grid, and that then generates me a float-based grid. And I would use Flexbox for this kind of UI items that it is designed for.
Okay, I see.
And then obviously in the future, I might swap out that SUSE generated stuff for CSS Grid Layout. But at the moment, that's kind of what I do in production.
Okay, and assuming obviously you get more browser support using something like SUSE than
yes,
Flexbox.
Absolutely. I mean, it's float based, but it's a nice piece of work. It is clever, and if you're using SAS, that's a good way to go.
Cool. Thanks.
It was the first relative unit grid system that I got to use. Because they were using M's at that time, and we were using 960 GS, if anyone remembers that awful thing. But it was a really good experience with SUSE, and I was trying to figure out, okay, well, how can I fall back Flexbox to something, and I found it seems obvious, but it didn't hit me that display flex, you can't really do display block unless you're doing media queries, right? But if you wanted to have it in the same media query, the same rule, you would need to really use floats as your fallback.
Yeah, I think the thing is we know what the problems are with floats. So it's kind of, if you're using floats, well, we kind of know all the edge cases. We know all the problems there. So you can you can usually sort of build stuff and get it working. And actually, what we see with Grid, we've got more capability than we've got with any of our existing layout methods. Being able to control both rows and columns and align things properly, horizontally and vertically, and so on. This is stuff that we just can't really do at the moment. And I think it's going to make a huge change to how the web looks ultimately.
So as far as like responsive web design, adaptive web design, just basically, I mean, how do the way that you construct layout objects in CSS change when you think about things like mobile first or responsive web design?
I think that what you tend to find when you start to work with Flexbox and then particularly with Grid, that you actually need fewer media queries. You don't need to spend so much time saying, oh, well, at this breakpoint I need to change the layout, because you get an awful lot of responsiveness. And you see that already in Flexbox. You say, oh, I've got these things and I want them to have equal amount of space between them, and if they get narrow enough, they'll wrap. You get all that without needing to even add media queries. So I think what you tend to find is you need fewer media queries, and all these sort of little precise sort of breakpoints people stick in to reorder their floats and sort things out. That kind of stuff will probably go away. So it certainly makes doing responsive design a lot easier because these things have come about since responsive was a thing. So they understand that that's the sort of world that they live in.
Okay. And have you experienced, a change in how you work with units and the types of units that you use? One of the things that I was working with was trying to figure out dynamic layouts using like calc, and now that custom properties are starting to get some push into meaning the variable spec is starting to get pushed into the browsers, we'll eventually be able to use that with calc. So have you seen have you used different units, like specific units, like the viewport units or the FR ones? I forget what they are.
Yeah, so all of these things really. I mean, obviously calc is useful, and where I tend to use that is things like pushing backgrounds on things around and small stuff like that. Not something I've really used so much in layout. Viewport units, fantastic, where you want to do sizing typography. Obviously, they're really handy for if you want your typography to kind of grow with the viewport. And also doing stuff like your big hero image at the top of a page, be able to say, I want this to cover the whole viewport or be half of the viewport, whatever. I think the really exciting thing that a lot of people, unless they've looked at grid layout, won't have encountered yet is the FR unit. And this idea of being able to say, I want this column to be, 1 fraction unit or 4 fraction units, and be able to have this kind of responsiveness and between your columns without needing to calculate percentages. And we see that already with things like flex basis and flex grow, that sort of flex factor, being able to work out the proportions.
Because it's fractional, right? You don't have to worry about I need 3.25%. It's just, this is a third.
Yeah.
Or
so
this is,
right?
Right?
I mean, if you have
that's how.
Yeah, if you have 12 columns and they're all 1 fraction unit each, you've got 12 equal width columns. If you make your first column 4 fraction units, then that one is going to be 4 times the size of the 1 fraction unit column. It's pretty much like, if you understand how flex grow and flex basis work, it's pretty much the same sort of thing.
Are there any serious performance implications on using things like calc and stuff like that? I've always wondered. Is that anything to worry about?
I think it probably depends really on what you're using this stuff, and it's certainly a bit early to see how sort of grid and flexbox and so on are going to stack up against each other. Certainly I know that Igalia, who are doing the implementation of grid in Blink and in WebKit, they started to do a bit of performance testing and looking at different ways of using grid. Because obviously there's lots of ways you could use something like grid. You could explicitly define your grid and say, here it is, everything's set and everything just sits in these holes. And then there's lots more dynamic ways to use grid layout, which mean an awful lot more kind of runtime calculation and potentially, multiple passes through to lay stuff out. And obviously those things are going to be slower. But how much slower, it's probably a little bit early to say. So I think with all of this new stuff, there's quite a bit of testing and working out what are the right choices to make at different points.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, it's a hard problem, right?
Together too. So I love the site that you put together with the grid examples, because it's so hard not knowing. I could look at each of the bugs inside of Firefox or Safari or whatever and kind of get an idea of how I can use these, or whether they're behind flags or whatever, but to actually test it in any browser to see, okay, if this works or not, have some useful examples. You have, I forget, I've been using it a lot, so I should know it offhand, but gridbyexample.com.
Yeah.
So that's been fantastic. So thank you for that. So I'm starting to see, the use cases for grid, because people explain it to me as you would use grid for your application, but you would use Flexbox for your components.
Yeah, I think that was kind of how the spec originally put itself out. But I think there's probably more. There are certainly components which are, more fit into the grid sort of way of doing things. Forms and things are probably better with grid rather than using Flexbox. There's various things I think on a smaller level which are also quite grid-like. And yeah, it's really just, I think we're a bit early for people to have really started using this stuff and saying, here's the use case. In fact, getting anyone to try out something that's behind a browser flag is fairly difficult. So.
Yeah, I remember doing the same with Flexbox, and now we can actually use it. So it's kind of exciting. We're hitting all these bugs now with Flexbox. We're like, oh, well, we have to know how to use this now. So it's like a learning curve. And
well, layout always has a learning curve, right? Especially now with the multitude of devices that we have to design for. You think about when I started, you had basically a very different landscape of devices, in the late 90s in terms of, oh, hey, here's my CRT, I'm good to go. There was a reason that 960GS existed, right? It was because for a long time that was sort of the target of targets, right? And now with the specs sort of moving forward with things like grid, and now that we have, Flexbox, and, we're going to have our pitfalls and, more likely pratfalls as we try to figure out exactly how to eke out every last living bit of performance out of them. So I think it's a learning process.
Yeah, and there's a lot to learn. There's an awful lot of just things that are very different to how we've been working in the past. And so there's quite a bit, I think, for people just to wrap their heads around, how this all works. And it's not just a direct replacement for something like Bootstrap. which I think is that's really what people are looking for a lot of the time.
And I think that's a valid case. I mean, if you want to replace XYZ thing that you're using, whether it's Bootstrap or whatever, you to some extent you're going to have to put in the time, right? I mean, to figure out exactly. There's a reason those things exist. As a user of Suzy, there's a reason that Suzy exists, and
Absolutely.
it works well. Am I going to replace it tomorrow if Grid was everywhere? Probably not, because I'm going to learn first how to make sure Grid works. Because my clients are going to be like, "Why are we ripping this out?" And I'm like, "Just because it has to happen now."
I forgot who said it. I think it was Leah Varro who said it. I'm not sure, but somebody said, well, if like your text, like is too small, or you can't read stuff, but if your layout breaks, then you don't know where things are going to be.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, that's why I think layout hasn't moved on in the way that other parts of CSS have moved on, because it is really hard to adopt a new layout system. And say, well, all these other browsers that don't support this, well, sorry, you've got no layout. So yeah, it's really hard. It's going to be hard, hard for people to start using Grid to start with. I think, and that is understandable. And I think this idea of using these things for smaller parts of your layout, using them as an enhancement, and then as we go forward, and I think we're in a better position these days in that with evergreen browsers are updating far more quickly, users are updating their browsers far more quickly, and we do get features, I think, into people's hands. So it is getting to a point where it is just those old IEs which are difficult to get rid of. If people are on a modern browser track, they are tending to be updating a bit faster.
And if you think globally, it's the old Androids too.
Yes, yeah, and the old Androids. Although then we're working with phones rather than desktops, so that may be in some ways a little easier to deal with.
Yeah, there's a case to be made that as developers, if we can progressively enhance our applications and start using some of these newer features, and users of these other browsers that don't quite support these yet, start to see a degradation in experience slightly, and then that kind of gives a case for like Apple and other browser vendors to really try and push these features, because their users are starting to see that they're not getting the best experience they could do. So if we try and kind of use these technologies in that way, we're essentially hopefully going to push the Apples and the browser vendors to try and adopt these features quicker, which would be really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally about seeing, you sort of see mention of, are there any signals from authors? Authors being us, the people who build for the web. If we're not talking about stuff, if there's not blog posts, if there's not people talking about it on podcasts, if there's no noise about these things, then it looks like nobody cares.
Yeah.
And so it's really important, if there are features that people like, it's really important to write about them, talk about them, go and vote them up on the the user voice for some browser. Most of the browsers have got a way of you letting them know you want something.
Yeah.
So if it's you want CSS shapes in Edge and in Firefox, whatever it is, make it known that that's important to you, because otherwise it's like, well, nobody's asking for this, so we'll not implement it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Instead of just going on "Can I use" or whatever and seeing, "Oh, I can't use that yet," and then that's it. Really look at how you can, progressively integrate it and then shout about it. I think that's a very good point.
Absolutely, and that's really important. There's a load of new stuff that we could potentially have that is just in like one browser, because they're the ones that have spearheaded that or whatever, and so it's kind of they've tried it out and so they've got an experimental implementation. If you like it, then you need to make sure you're talking about it. Otherwise, you don't get it.
Yeah.
Do you think a lot of people will be using shapes, or even, I thought I heard that float was going to have 2 new properties or 2 new values for the property?
So shapes, I think I'm always surprised that more people aren't using shapes, because it's a really nice progressive enhancement. You can, as long as you don't do anything really crazy that is going to cause like text to lay over an image if the shape doesn't happen. Your sort of typical use case of, I want my testimonials have got a little square image and I'd like them to be round, and using shapes and clip path to make the images round and curving the text around it. Well, that's fine. It's fine if it's just floated and it's squared off in some browsers. You can do that. it's a bit like how we progressively enhanced with rounded corners when border radius became a thing, and so it always seems surprising to me that more people aren't using that, and I think it is that thing people look on can I use, say, oh, only 50% of my users are going to be able to see it, and so don't use it.
Yeah.
It's funny. I use Shapes the other day, and it's pretty trick. I do enjoy Shapes. I wish it was available in more places.
Mm-hmm.
But I did have a question. Does anyone use border radius just out of spite now? I feel like I use border radius out of spite on things. Just, you know what? It took forever for y'all to implement this. You know what? 5px everywhere. And just whole sites just border radius to Kingdom Come. Just why not? Users like, I don't understand. Why do we need border radius for this?
I'm still waiting for the flaming text property.
I think you should make an NPM module that'll take all of your table layouts with your that'll take all of your border radiuses and convert them to table layouts with little corner GIFs on each.
If that ever comes back around, I'm out. I'm done. I'm like, that's it for me. I've
the 9 slice.
Oh, terrifying experience.
That's what you can call the NPM module, 9 slice.
It's amazing the web survived that. Let's all be honest. Like, if anybody doesn't remember the 9 slice or just the horribleness of I want corners on things. No, let's not ever go back to that. Let's work on specs and features, people. Say it with me. Act now. Features.
I particularly like the fact that it was back in the day when we couldn't do rounded corners on things. All of our designs had these really rounded corners and all this stuff and gradients and all this stuff that we couldn't actually do. And we're having to slice up images to do. And now we've got them. We're flat design.
Yeah, I know. That blows my mind. I was thinking about that. I had that exact same conversation the other day with someone. They're like, you know what? No. Border radius, we just get rid of it. It doesn't need to be in the spec anymore. No one uses it. I was like, it took forever to get it. Don't get rid of it
Every
now.
art form, though, that happens. There's always some sort of reactionary view, right?
Yeah.
It happens. It happens in modern art, right? Futurism was one of them that was really, really big. So, yeah, just total tangent on art, but it's interesting to me the parallels of web design and art, like fine arts.
Yeah, I wonder if you can kind of see the sort of just the way that things work and the sort of general path that things take kind of speeded up in the web, because it seems that the timelines are very shortened, compared to say the history of art. You wonder if how much that sort of is speeded up in the way that we're doing things on the web, moving from one thing to the other.
Yeah, would Da Vinci's style changed like that? that would have been fascinating to me. He's like, you know what? No, oils. I'm out of oils now. I'm going 9 slice corners. Yep, this is the future for me.
It's interesting too. Shapes, that particular spec struck me as it reminded me of when I was working in InDesign doing print.
Mm.
Because you would have these shapes that you could flow text through, right? And flow text around.
Yeah.
And so since we have a younger crowd now on the web doing development, I wonder if we'll have new and innovative type of things come out of that rather than these old ideas of print.
Yeah. I mean, another thing. Because Shapes came from Adobe, and so you can kind of see its heritage there. And the other thing that we have, which is kind of got pushed on the back burner, is regions, which is very much like that, flowing text into a layout, which you do. And I think actually once we've got grid, regions start to make more sense. I've done some little demos of that, because I think that once you've got grid and we can create a complex grid layout, then being able to take a block of text and flow it into that layout becomes more of an enticing prospect.
From a content perspective, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, just being able to keep your content as a single thing and not having to break it up in order to try and display it. So regions is very much sort of comes from that idea, that sort of print heritage, I guess.
We didn't really talk too much about it, but I think it's a really big topic, is preprocessors and postprocessors. I know the Thoughtbot, who does Neat and Bourbon. They do a bunch of mix-ins dealing with Flexbox, and I'm not sure if they have grid or anything. Like, what is the tooling around preprocessors, postprocessors, and the state of the union there?
I think around grid, there's not really very much, just because it's sort of early days. I mean, the spec's still changing in reality. So, and I think there are actually some issues with SAS in the current release with line-based stuff, just because grid brings with it a whole bunch of new syntax, which of course preprocessors then haven't seen before, and so there are potential conflicts and things with that.
You experienced that with web components too, I remember.
Yeah, I mean that's bound to happen where you bring in brand new syntax. The preprocessors aren't expecting that, and so I think there are. But I think there's lots of things in which it would be useful, and certainly I think as well for backwards compatibility. Where places where maybe you want to do one thing and overwrite it with grid and things. There's probably scope for mix-ins and things that can help with that kind of stuff. Be certainly interested to see what people start to come up with as we get grid into production use.
Let's make a bootstrap around it.
Yeah, I think it's with all of this stuff. I really hope that people will learn how to use it first, because generally I think I'm a great fan of SAS. We use SAS a lot for our own stuff. But I think it is really important that people make sure they do learn the core technologies before then layering something like SAS on top. Because I get a lot of people emailing me with CSS problems. And an awful lot of them, possibly more of them than not, are actually SAS problems. So that they think they've got a CSS problem. Actually, they've caused themselves a CSS problem with their SAS. And that's because they don't understand what the output is they're creating. So really, the important thing is to know what you're creating and then find the things that let you do it faster and more effectively and things.
Yeah, we're definitely going to do a show on that, dealing with scale of CSS, because that was one thing. I worked on a very large-scale project in Ruby and SAS, and we encountered a lot of that stuff that you're talking about, and dealing with things like SAS. This was my first SAS project, and the CSS selectors, because developers didn't really know CSS that well, like they were Ruby developers, and they just, okay, whatever's there, we're just going to use, and they would nest it, because SAS makes it really easy to nest everything, so this way you can, it's all in one module. Well, that's great, except that your selectors are going to be humongous, and so you're going to have severe problems with your performance. So it's definitely an interesting topic, I think.
Yeah, I think it's like everything, if you're using libraries and frameworks or anything, and without understanding what the core technologies are, then ultimately you're not going to know where the problems are lying when you run into a problem.
Yeah, the big one was jQuery, obviously, in the JavaScript world. I know JavaScript. I know you don't.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're running up against time. We got a couple more minutes. Is there anything that we missed to talk about as far as CSS layouts go?
I think we've talked about quite a lot of this stuff. I mean, really, what I would say to people is have a look at these things. Because as we've already mentioned, it's only by sort of web developers getting their hands on them, playing with them, finding where things don't work. That feedback is really important to the CSS working group. Who have now moved all their issues to GitHub, so you can actually go and have a look and see what issues have been raised against different specs, and comment on them, and you can talk about that stuff, and you can raise issues if you see problems with the spec, and that's really useful to know, because a lot of the people working on CSS specs aren't actually building websites themselves; they're spec authors or they're browser vendors. So it's really great to get feedback from other developers who are using this stuff, saying, hey, this is something that I want to be able to do and I can't. So yeah, look at this stuff, play with it, talk about it, make a noise so that browser vendors see that we care about these things, because that all makes the web better.
Yeah, put a PR on the GitHub issues, right?
Yeah,
or a GitHub issue.
Yeah. Go and have a look. I mean, it's brilliant because it was all in a mailing list, which was horrible to try and read through and to find things. And now it's all on GitHub. It's kind of where we are. We all know how to use GitHub, and we know how to read the issues and post issues and things. So I think it's going to make things a lot easier for people to get involved.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Rachel. If people want to find you or help contribute to your research, how can they catch you, and what's your Twitter handle?
Yeah, so I'm at Rachel Andrew on Twitter and pretty much everywhere else. And my personal site is rachelandrew.co.uk. And yeah, I mean, if you've got sort of grid questions or things you think can't be built or whatever, I'm always interested in those. I like a challenge. So, but yeah, I enjoy talking about layout. So it's always interesting to see what people are interested in.
Yeah, and I love that you work on a CMS daily, which is like one of the hardest things. We spoke about this earlier, but it's one of the hardest things I think for developers to do, especially front-end developers, to have to think of all those cases for CMS. And for you to be taking on layout and working on that, I think that combination is just, you've put out so much great research and information for the community, so thank you for that.
Cool, thanks.
All right, so this has been episode number 93, and CSS modules and CSS layout, composition, and modules. Thanks for joining us.